Another lecture. This is number 70, and the topic we're looking at is 7.11, Interwar Foreign Policy, and the theme is America in the World. Our learning objective for today is explain the similarities and differences in attitudes about the nation's proper role in the world. So we're going to pick up right at the end of World War I here, and the United States is going to pick a unilateral foreign policy. That means that they're going to be acting on their own, trying to navigate this international politics of the 1920s. So in the years following World War I, the United States pursued a unilateral foreign policy that used international investment, peace treaties, and select military intervention to promote a vision of international order, even while maintaining U.S. isolationism. So for the international investment, we helped develop the Dawes Plan. And the Dawes Plan is a plan to try and continue to have the payments of reparations from Germany to go to France and Britain, and for the loans from France and Britain that they owe to the United States to be repaid back to us. So it creates this circle of money that starts with us and ends with us. And it's meant to pay the reparations because at the end of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany is blamed for the entire war, and so therefore they have to pay a cash amount for the damage that they've caused in other countries. And because they don't have a certain amount of cash, then France decides that it would instead take the value of heavy machinery that they had in Germany. And so that's going to limit their ability to continue to repay these reparations because they don't have the means or capacity to produce goods. Meanwhile, Britain and France have to repay the United States for the loans that they were taking out while they were fighting World War I, and we were neutral. And as we get closer into the Depression era, we try to put a pause on the repayment of payments from Germany to France and Britain, but because France does not want there to be a pause, then the whole system falls apart. So that's going to be successful until it's not. We also try to set up reciprocal trade agreements under FDR, so we're moving away from the era of high tariffs in the 1920s that helped make the Depression a more harsh situation for us and the rest of the world. And then as far as peace treaties, we are looking to enter into treaties, but we're doing this outside of the work that the League of Nations is doing. So we invite a bunch of other countries in 1921 through 1922 to Washington, D.C., and we have them sign the 5 Powers Treaty, and there's also the 9 Powers Treaty. You see a picture in the bottom right here of all the countries that are there. There's Japan, Great Britain, France, Italy, and we're trying to set a limit to the amount of naval power that countries are going to continue to build. So we set a ratio that we are comfortable with, that the United States is going to be the baseline here. And so if the United States builds more naval power, then other countries can also build naval power. And countries like Japan are going to be able to do this at a reduced ratio of how many ships we build. So it's a little bit unfair, but everyone enters into this treaty agreeing that this is what's going to keep the peace, because as long as everyone keeps building up at the same rate, then there's not going to be any cause for war. And we also sign enter into the 1928 Kellogg-Briand Pact. And this is essentially saying that any international conflict that comes about will not be resolved using violence or war. Now, that sounds really great and idealistic, but in reality, the Kellogg-Briand Pact did allow for defensive wars, and it created no repercussions for anyone that attacked someone else with their military. So there was no way of enforcing it, and for that reason, when other countries started to attack new territories, there was nothing that could really be done. All right, so for select military intervention, we were essentially just watching other countries be aggressive and try to conquer new territory. So, for example, Japan is in the midst of expanding its Pacific Empire. And they attacked Korea, the Korean Peninsula, earlier in the century, in 1910. And in 1931, they say, all right, we want more territory. And they attack northern China, which is the territory that's called Manchuria. They take it over and they rename it to Manchukuo. And there's absolutely no action by the international community, regardless of all of the war crimes that are alleged in the region, of the aggressiveness that Japan had already promised that they weren't going to do at the previous conferences. Europe and the United States don't really have a response other than the Stimson Doctrine, which basically says that we are not going to recognize Manchukuo as part of Japan. That is still technically going to be considered Chinese territory. So it's not really much of a repercussion because Japan is still there. They still have forces there, and that won't change until the end of World War II. So we are also going to try and maintain isolationism. As World War II begins to ramp up in Europe, in 1935, FDR signs the Neutrality Acts, then they are passed again in 1936, and then one more time in 1937, each time trying to make new provisions to ensure that the United States is not dragged into another global conflict. FDR gives a speech that's referred to as his quarantine speech. So he wants to quarantine the aggressors, that all the other democracies in the world need to exclude them, ostracize them for being aggressive towards other countries. Now, at the same time, he's also leading a preparedness movement because, very much like Woodrow Wilson saw in the lead up to World War I, it seemed almost inevitable that the United States was going to have to step in and help their former allies. So we passed the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940, again instituting a peacetime draft to try and get ready for a possible conflict. All right, and then we're going to enter into World War II. In the 1930s, while many Americans were concerned about the rise of fascism and totalitarianism, most opposed taking military action against the aggression of Nazi Germany and Japan until the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor drew the United States into World War II. So there was a rise of fascism and totalitarianism all across the world. It really wasn't just across Europe. We had Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, Franco in Spain, because the Spanish Civil War had been going on earlier in the 1930s, and Franco's fascist forces ended up winning. And Hideki Tojo in Japan, who's a general, ends up really taking control from the Emperor Hirohito and leading Japan towards this imperialist crusade across the Pacific. There is a shift in policy for the United States because now we're viewing the world in this democracy versus fascist lens or worldview. So FDR is calling to protect the four freedoms. That's freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of want, and freedom of fear. And he is going to do what he can to help the Allied powers to fight against the Axis powers and the fascist powers in whatever way he can by still not breaking the Neutrality Act. So one of the programs is called Cash and Carry. Basically, if Allied powers were to purchase military goods from the United States and paid in cash and then transported those goods themselves across the Atlantic Ocean, then that was going to be allowed under the Neutrality Act. We also do something similar with the program of Destroyers for Bases, the Lend-Lease Act, and the Atlantic Charter is a pact between FDR and Winston Churchill about what a possible war with the United States would look like and what the final outcome of the war would be. So all of this is really ramping up to get the United States ready and prepared for war. There is opposition to action at first. So during the lead up in the early years of World War II, there is the America First Committee, and one of its main proponents is Charles Lindbergh. So you remember him from a previous lecture. He became famous because he was the first man to do a solo flight across the Atlantic Ocean. He went from New York to Paris in his airplane called the Spirit of the St. Louis. And because of his actions, Charles Lindbergh has been alleged to be sympathetic to the Nazi ideals. There's not quite a lot of evidence that Lindbergh was a Nazi himself, but he did ascribe to certain racial ideologies. And so it's because of those affiliations that he has been alleged to be a Nazi. That, again, is not confirmed and not really able to be proven. There were Nazi sympathizers in the U.S., though, and there has been a great short documentary film called The Night at the Garden, which documents one of these Nazi rallies that had an American twist to them. It was a large gathering in Madison Square Garden in New York City, and you can see from the picture on the bottom left that you have George Washington in the middle in a large banner, and you had people dressed up like brown shirts at the Madison Square Garden, praising the things that the Nazi regime stood for. There were counter-protesters outside. One tried to go into the building. If you can find it on the internet, it's very short. It's about 14 minutes long. I recommend it. So again, there's still a varied response to the war and the United States entry into it. That is until December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And so the day that it happens, the news spreads throughout the country. A lot of people in the United States didn't know where Pearl Harbor was because Hawaii was not yet a state. But FDR informs the nation about the nation being attacked. About 2,000 people died in all, service members and civilians, during the attacks, which is about the same amount of people who died in the September 11th attacks. And FDR names this as a day that will live in infamy. So it was definitely remembered much more strongly in the mid-20th century. It was very traumatic. People remember exactly where they were when the United States was attacked in 1941. And because they were attacked, it builds popular support for the United States' entry into the war. All right, so here's our recap. The United States tried to maintain peaceful relations without joining the League of Nations. There were unilateral treaties that were unsuccessful in maintaining peace abroad. And as fascist leaders became more aggressive, U.S. policy shifted to support democracies and old allies. And then finally, in December 7th, 1941, the United States enters into war over the Pearl Harbor attack. All right, well, thank you for watching this lecture. Please come back for the next ones in which we will be going deeper into World War II, about what it was like for the United States at home and what was it like for the United States on the war front. All right, thank you for watching, and I'll see you then.